When you hear the word immigration, I'm sure most people are thinking immediately something either positive or negative.
Migration is as old as mankind.
It is. Migration is something that's always existed. The question is, how do we make the most of it? How do we make decisions about who crosses borders and who doesn't, who's admitted and who isn't? How do we make sure that those who are living in the country are integrated and that those that were here already are also having their opportunities to get ahead?
Welcome to the Tao of Chao podcast, where we will try to find balance and provide a clearer path forward in this uncertain world.
Dr. Andrew Selee is president of Migration Policy Institute, MPI, a global nonpartisan institution that seeks to improve immigration and integration policies through fact-based research, opportunities for learning and dialogue, and development of new ideas to address complex policy questions. A position he assumed in 2017. He also chairs MPI Europe's Administrative Council. Dr. Selee's research focuses on migration globally, with a special emphasis on immigration policy in the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He's the author of several books as well. Dr. Selee was the co-director of the Regional Migration Study Group, convened by MPI with the Wilson Center, and part of the steering committee for MPI's independent task force on immigration and America's future. He holds a PhD in policy studies from the University of Maryland, an MA in Latin American studies from the University of California, San Diego. And here is Dr. Andrew Selee. Andrew, thank you so much for spending time with us and being here with me on Tao of Chao podcast.
Well, Philip, it's great to be with you on the show, and I've been looking forward to this as well ever since we met, and we've continued this conversation.
What we're going to talk about is not only timely, but seems like perpetually timely. So I know we're in a silly season now. I think silly season is election season, but anyway, silly season, and so we're going to hear a lot more about the kind of topic that we're going to talk about. But we're not going to get into politics. That's not what we're spending time on. It's really trying to learn from you and your expertise in migration and immigration issues. So before we get started, Andrew, perhaps just tell us a little bit about you, your organization, and what you are doing with your organization in the subject matter.
When you hear the word immigration, I'm sure most people are thinking immediately something either positive or negative, right? I mean, this goes into lots of feelings and lots of reactions, especially during silly season.
Yeah.
But in reality, migration is something that's always existed. The question is, how do we make the most of it? How do we make decisions about who crosses borders and who doesn't, who's admitted and who isn't? How do we make sure that those who are living in the country are integrated and that those that were here already are also having their opportunities to get ahead? And so I work for the Migration Policy Institute. I'm the president of the Migration Policy Institute, started by a great man named Dimitri Papadimitriou back almost 22 years ago now. And the idea of our work, we're a think tank, we're a public policy center, if you want, with offices in DC and in Brussels, Belgium, but we work around the world, and we try and figure out pragmatic ways of approaching migration. So we do a lot of number crunching, data, looking at just who's moving where, some basic factual research, but we also do a lot of trying to figure out what policies make sense in terms of managing migration in the United States, but also in other countries around the world, and sometimes in global conversations.
Interesting, because migration is as old as mankind.
It is.
Once we stood up and on twos, we were migrating.
We were indeed, right? Yes, and other species migrate, right? I mean, it's just part of the natural order. So, I mean, it is neither a good nor a bad. It is something that is, right? It is part of the human condition and part of the broader thing that living things do. But obviously in societies and having, created a world that now has states with boundaries and borders around them, it does bring up all sorts of questions about how people move, when they move, where they can move to. So there's a lot to talk about.
And maybe a lot of it has to do with how the world typically think a world of scarcity rather than abundance.
Yes.
And it's through scarcity that we say, well, gee, I don't have as much and I want to go to somewhere that has more, either opportunity or food or shelter or whatever it is to survive. Perhaps that will enter into our human behavior.
scarcity and looking for opportunity, right? And looking for, and sometimes survival, right? I mean, there's also, it's a smaller percentage, but there's a lot of people who move just to be able to survive, and a lot more who move for opportunity, to try and do something better or to get away from a tough situation.
So before we get started, maybe I like to read a couple of items. I'm sure you know these, but I want to sort of set the frame a little bit for us to dive in a little bit deeper about migration or immigration. So according to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO report I'm reading now, the current U.S. immigration surge is unprecedented. The influx flew under the radar for some time, dismissed simply as pent-up immigration from when borders essentially closed during the pandemic. But this year, CBO budget and economic outlook brought new attention to the migrant inflow and its expected economic effects. By incorporating previously unavailable data on migration along the southwest border into the government economic and fiscal outlook, the macroeconomic implications of such high levels of migration come into focus. By CBO's estimates, net migration, I was surprised by these numbers, was 2.7 million in 22. The labor force in 2023 is estimated to be larger by 5.2 million. So in 2022 was 2.7 million, but in 2023 is estimated to be 5.2 million net migration. As a result of immigration surge, GDP will be higher, I'm talking about 2023 number, by 8.9 trillion. That's significant. And federal government tax revenue, that's kind of important, 1.2 trillion more dollars going into the federal coffers over the 2024 period. So the deficits will be lower by 900 billion because of this net migration. I didn't say illegal or legal, I'm just simply saying migration. In 2023 alone, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, personnel encountered 2.54 million migrants at the southwest border. This is about the same as 2.58 million in 2022, a record year in 2022. This compares with the pre-pandemic average. I didn't realize it's only 500,000. That's significant. That's 4 to 4.5 times more. Since the pandemic began in the US in February 2020, CBP has recorded almost 8 million encounters at the southwest border, along with almost 2 million encounters at the northern border, which we don't talk about actually, or we don't hear much about, and coastal borders and airports. So I guess we can fly in and say, I'm here as an illegal migrant. In first class, preferably. In 2023, fewer than a quarter of encounters at the southwest U.S. border ended in migrants being refused entry into the United States. This is a reversal from previous 9 years, when more than half of the 8.7 million migrants apprehended at the southern border were not admitted to the U.S., and less than a quarter were allowed in. According to a study by Center for Global Development, the overlooked pull factor, Danny Bahar, I believe you know him. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, right? Stated from his research over the past few years, when the U.S. has experienced an all-time high in border crossings, as well as the all-time high in labor market tightness. However, during those same years, there is no particular economic shock in the main immigrant sending countries of an order of magnitude that can explain the rapid increase in border crossing. So I guess he's trying to link the tightness of labor market in the United States and the all-time high migration to the United States when their local countries did not show extra economic stress. The author estimated the elasticity across Democratic and Republican administration, and separately across 4 different presidential terms of Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. He did not find the relationship between border crossing and labor market tightness to be statistically different, well, in our case, would be significant, across different presidential terms. This implies that the economic foundations of border crossing transcend conventional politic narratives. So I'm not going to read any more, but it's fascinating because what I as a layperson reading this, I mean, you know this, you could take a nap. When I was reading this, that is not how we have felt. We thought that immigration had been net negative for the United States, or at least that's the potential rhetoric. And it turned out from these statistics may not be negative. So love to hear your thoughts on some of the stuff that we talked about, and let's have a conversation on all these interesting
No,
factors.
great, Philip. Those are two great reports, and I mean, I think it tells us two essential things, right? One is that we are getting a lot of immigration; something has changed, and that a big driver of this is actually our economy. We're actually pulling people in rather than people are running away from other things. It's not that people don't have things to run away from, or advantages from coming here, because certainly they do in many cases, but that the bigger factor is the pull that comes when the US economy is good and the labor market is tight, right? And so these are, I mean, it tells you there's a huge national self-interest in this, right? A huge national interest in immigration, helping deal with labor market openings, helping contribute to the tax base,
Yes.
bringing down the deficit, generating economic growth. All of these are really good things. However, we can also imagine, because some of this immigration does not happen in legal ways, it also creates other drags on the society and the economy, right? I mean, first and foremost, knowing who's in the country, having a process to choose who comes in. Also, people being able to access basic benefits and being registered, so we know where they are. And then, of course, the whole question, and it's obviously hard for them also if they're not able to be legally present, worried about being sent back at some point. And then there's a whole question about when there's rapid change. It could be good for the macro effects of the impact on the macro side for the economy. But also imagine schools, for example, or hospital emergency rooms, that there could be also effects that are less positive in schools that are suddenly having to adjust to multilingual classrooms that aren't quite prepared, or the arrival of students in large numbers that they didn't expect, which might be fine over time, but in the short term is a shock, or emergency rooms with patients who don't have health care, right? So I think we should assume that this is probably a net good if we want to look at it overall, but that doesn't mean that there aren't real stresses and strains that come with immigration, especially if it isn't planned and if it isn't done through legal channels.
So when you think about, 8 million over the last 2-3 years together, that's a significant number. We are actually one of the countries, if you look at the top 10 countries that population is still growing, we happen to be number 10, but still top 10. If you compare to China, Japan, Korea, I mean, you just run the whole gamut. Everybody else is falling off a cliff potentially for various different reasons, but U.S. is not. And it's almost a common wisdom to say that if a country shrinks in size, it shrinks in its GDP and its relevance and military force, all the reasons why you don't want to shrink. But on the other hand, U.S. is not shrinking if we continue to have migrants of one kind or another. So the question is, how do we find that balance in our minds? Is it that we only want certain type of migrants but not other type of migrants? I mean, if you look at the numbers that I was reading off, that it really contributed significantly to our economy, to our tax base, to our GDP, whatever, all the things that I mentioned, that has actually shown up in our economy in the last 2-3 years. That was really helpful because it actually tempered inflation. It could have been even worse because the tightness of labor. Yes, did the wages go up? It could have gone up even more if we didn't have enough people. All those type of things. We cannot prove the negative, but it's logical to say that this surge in workers perhaps actually have dampened the potentially even worse inflation factor, potentially. What's your thought on how do we talk about all those things?
I mean, I think that's right, and that's what the Fed has told us consistently, is that actually, inflation has been tempered somewhat by the arrival of immigrants. And some of these immigrants are coming legally, by the way. I mean, this does include, we do have robust legal immigration in the United States.
Yeah.
What is evident is we don't have as much legal immigration as the economy needs, especially when the labor market is tight and the economy is hot, right? That's, there may be times in an economic downturn where the levels are right. But we don't have that all the time, especially when the economy is heating up. We last had a visa reform in the United States in 1990. 1990 was a very different economy. And most of our categories, except for some of the family categories, immediate family members and agricultural workers, interestingly enough. But most other categories, we set caps on how many people can come. And so those caps were set 34 years ago in a very different economy, and we've stuck to them. But it is then hard to get workers we need for the economy through the legal channels, and people find their ways around this, right? And they come in different ways. So I think we should assume immigration is one of the greatest assets the United States has. It has always been. It is we can talk more about this in it, but it is a source of entrepreneurship and innovation. And growth, right? I mean, it is, there's a lot of evidence that immigrants are a big source of actually innovation and entrepreneurship. We can go into some of the numbers on that, but also just in terms of growth, right? And keeping a working age population that is paying taxes and maintaining social services and paying into Social Security. And in this case, although it's not a good thing, but it's a good thing for people getting old. It's not a good thing for the immigrant workers, but there's a number of immigrant workers who will never be able to, of the non-documented immigrant workers who will never get Social Security, but they're paying into the Social Security system. So there is a bit of an extra boon coming from that. It would be better if actually they had legal status and would eventually be able to pull out their contributions and Social Security checks, but that's not the case for many of them. So, look, this is keeping our economy going. It's keeping our economy vital. Other countries like Japan and Korea and Italy and Spain are struggling and Greece actually go through quite and even some medium-sized, it's surprising countries like Malaysia and Brazil, right? I mean, countries that are still, we don't think of as developed countries, but they're certainly on the high end of emerging economies, also are beginning to see their populations go down. Countries can adapt to this by innovating in technology, by increasing productivity,
Yep.
But there are certain things that it's hard to replace workers with, right? I mean, there are some things that you can replace workers with technology. There are some areas of the economy where simply you can be more productive, but it's going to be impossible to recruit, in a declining population to replace everyone with technology or productivity, right? And so that's where immigration comes in. It's not necessarily one-to-one substitute. It's not to say, every country that begins to have declining population, you're going to need the same number of immigrant workers as those who are leaving the workforce. But you are going to need some immigrant workers and a fair number. And the U.S. has been blessed in that, right? We've been successful in being able to have people wanting to come to this country. I mean, this is still the country that probably attracts workers and students and folks that want to come here more than any other place on earth.
Yeah.
That may change over time, but it's still a real destination for many people to study and work. And that has allowed us to keep a robust and vibrant economy. Now, figuring out how we do that in a way that privileges legal immigration and not irregular immigration is a challenge, because we do want people to come in legally. That's for the good of the credibility of the system. And it's good for the economy that people are here legally, that they're able to pay into and take out Social Security, that they are able to get the same benefits as everyone else. I mean, all those things are important. So the system we have is far from perfect, but from an economic perspective, this has been a boon always to the United States and continues to be.
As I'm listening to you, Andrew, you talk about the type of immigrants, or in a AI-driven high-tech future that we envision. Now, of course, we still need STEM type people who are really good at math or really good at IT or whatever it is they're really good at. But the productivity is going to continue to multiply for that segment, and you may not need as many actual physical bodies to do that, for example. Whereas there are certain lower skill workers or work that still need human labor. I'm sort of separating it out as I'm hearing it, I want you to tell me if I'm thinking correctly, at least in the foreseeable future. I mean, that may eventually robots will set up robots who can do all this, and we don't need manual labor anymore. That's entirely not only possible, but perhaps likely. If you take a look at what Japan, they have what is an exoskeleton that help old folks get up and go to the bathroom themselves, and they don't need a nurse to help them. Things like that. Certainly, that is not even the future; it's the present. But mowing the lawn is apparently we still don't have a lawnmower that can just by itself as a robot yet, or quite the way that we want it. So a lot of the more blue collar workers blue collar work is still being fulfilled by lower end income folks, which tend to be potentially migrants. Certainly farming, I know that has already reduced by more automation in farming as well, but still there's a need for human hands to do certain things.
Right. Yeah.
That in itself is having angst by that segment of population who feel that they are being replaced by quote unquote lower pay workers. So although we need them, there seems to be a significant pushback by the very people who feel that they are being replaced by either legal or illegal, primarily illegal, obviously, coming in. Is that just an impression? Is it true? Is the American worker being really replaced, or that is just their vision of what they think it is happening? Can you help me to understand that a little bit?
You're right that there are huge needs in the U.S. economy, both for high-skilled workers and for lesser skilled workers.
Yeah.
Although even when we talk lesser skilled workers, berry picking or, care work is actually fairly skilled, but we wouldn't count it as high skilled work.
Right.
But it is still skilled work in its own way. But but high skilled, is important, although it is easier to outsource in some cases, right? And increasingly that, there's a population of people in the higher skilled workforce who collaborate across national boundaries, right? And you can think of, and you have corporate offices spread across the world. You have labs who are interconnected across different countries. I mean, that is possible. The reason you want higher skilled workers is they tend to often be the ones who innovate, who drive new technology, new innovations. But a lot of that work can be done collaboratively across boundaries. But it is the things like, again, berry picking, care work, that is very hard construction work,
yes,
for which you do need people, right? And you do need people physically present. The studies all tell us that most immigrant workers are complements rather than substitutes for American workers, which is to say they're moving into different sectors of the economy than most American workers. There can be exceptions to this in some places where there is some competition, but generally speaking, they tend to move either into very high niches in the economy or into lower paid niches, both where American workers are not as prevalent, or where they're expanding in the case of some of the higher skilled niches. So yeah, it is not probably for most people a real threat that they will lose their job to an immigrant worker. It's unlikely to be working in an area that an immigrant worker is going to be moving in, but it is certainly something that makes people worry. And I think others worry about cultural change. They worry that the society is changing quickly, and it's true as people are not widgets, right? As people come in, unlike you can bring in goods from around the world, but the goods don't change things, right? I mean, people change things. They change cultural patterns. We can argue that they change them for good, right? That's one of the great things that has made America great, is that it is a tapestry of so many backgrounds, right? And always has been. But people feel that change as something unexpected and unknown, and it definitely moves the ground under them. And we should understand that is a real challenge. And when numbers are high, that is a real challenge, particularly in places that see high numbers of immigrants. And then, of course, people just worry about the idea of illegality, of people coming without documents, maybe not being security checked, and those are real concerns as well. But that has little to do with the economic side of it, but it does have to do with the sense that countries should have some control about who comes across the border. So the reality is, we do need workers. We know that they are moving into areas of the economy where we need them, and we're going to need fairly high numbers of immigrants. But we do have to be sensitive to the pace of change. We do have to be sensitive if there are sectors where that could be subject to some competition between workers and immigrants, though those seem to be fairly few from what we know. And obviously, we do want to be making effort to create real legal channels for people to come, so that they're not coming across the border hidden in trucks or any other way.
So far, what I've discussed with you is, one, they are potentially net positive from an economic standpoint. They help to contribute to tax base, and they help to defray some of the future cost of Social Security. But to balance that, there is demand on housing, social services, hospital services, and on and on and on. And that local communities need to adjust and perhaps invest more to service all the new mouths that they need to feed in an area, wherever that may be. On the other hand, I also hear you say we're not seeing a tremendous amount, or even close to tremendous amount, of replacement. In other words, they are supplementing rather than replacing American workers.
That is right.
That's a broad statement.
Immigrants are not only workers, of course, they're also consumers, right? So on one hand, you do have people moving the labor force, but they're also consuming goods, right, and driving the economy. And two of the things we know about immigrant workers, which are really fascinating, and they shouldn't be that surprising, but they still surprise me. And so I suspect they surprise others too. I mean, one is that about a quarter of the patents in the United States are filed by groups of innovators that have at least one immigrant in them, right? And there's a lot of suspicion that the reason for this, there's a great book by a guy named Zeke Hernandez, who's a professor at Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's a great writer. I highly recommend the book called The Truth About Immigration. And it is a completely sort of factual, like, what do we know about the evidence? It's really fascinating. Is that, what he thinks, and he's been able to trace this in some of his research, is that you actually have, people coming from different scientific backgrounds and different experiences. And that exercise of people coming together, within a lab or within a research group often leads to innovations. And so that's why you have such a high number of immigrant, innovators who actually are part of our innovation system, way beyond what you would expect. And immigrants are about 14% of the United States, right? Slightly less than 14%. So to have them in a quarter of all patents is, almost doubly representative of what you would expect. The other one is that immigrants are about 90% more likely to start a small business or start any business than a native-born American.
Yes.
Right. And this is really surprising. I mean, and it turns out it's true across nationalities. You would think, yes, but these are just the Chinese and the Indian immigrants, and they're better educated. And, but no, it turns out to also hold for Mexicans and Central Americans and people from Southeast Asia. And, it actually holds. Some groups are have slightly higher rates than others, but almost all national groups have higher rates of entrepreneurship than native-born Americans. And there's at least a couple reasons. I mean, one is actually exclusion, that for some immigrants who have a middle-class background, they realize that they're never going to be able to exercise their profession again. It's hard to become a doctor in the United States, right? And so, or it's hard to become a lawyer again. And so people sometimes say, I'm going to start a small business and, I'm a qualified professional. If I can't practice, I'm going to do something else that will lead me back to the middle class. But the other is there seems to be some self-selection, right? I mean, the people who are willing to pick up, whether it is, people crossing the border illegally, we like it or not, but, that takes some gumption, right? And people coming on a visa also saying, I'm going to go out and figure out how to navigate the craziness of the U.S. visa regime, and I'm going to come study in the United States, or I'm going to come and, take a chance on a job I'm being offered in the United States, or I'm going to follow a relative in the United States. These are people who often are risk takers, right? Or they're at least above average as risk takers. And so there seems to be something about that that's hard to quantify still. People are still trying to figure out exactly what's the mix here. But there does seem to be something about people who move from one country to another that leads them to also be the same kind of people who would start new businesses. And we really depend on innovators and entrepreneurs to keep the economy moving forward and becoming more productive.
I think you hit on both of those are right on. I mean, I'm an immigrant, and I have been in business on my own for, I won't give away my age, but many decades, shall we say. And my parents who came and they started small businesses. I think part of it is exclusive. I mean, excluding them from normal jobs.
Yes.
Either language or social status, whatever that may be. And the other is that it is not easy to pick up and leave your own country to go to a new land. So those people who are willing to do that is not only because they have to, is because they really wanted to for a better future, and that is risk taking. Which is the basic thing you need to start your own business, is to be able to be willing to embrace risk and manage risk, and hopefully you have a better chance of a life. But it also speaks so highly of the United States. It is truly a land of opportunities where we are, for hard work, willing to take risks, we can still make a difference in our own lives. And you cannot say that in many other countries. So from that standpoint, not only we have more jobs here during the last, post-COVID time that we just talked about, but we're also showing up. There is a better chance of us making a living than just about anywhere else if we just roll up our sleeves and do it.
That's right. And I think there's still something about this country being a country that has a very flexible labor market. There's low barriers to entry in the labor market. You don't have to, compared to Germany, for example, which is also a robust economy and a large GDP, but it is an economy where it is heavily regulated, right? I think most of Northern Europe is very heavily regulated in the labor market. This is a much less regulated labor market. It's easy to move in. It is also a country that has lots of diasporas. It has lots of groups of people from other countries, right? And so it's easy to move in sometimes. Sometimes people start off as a small entrepreneur. If they're from the Philippines, they're selling to other people from the Philippines. They start a store that caters to people from their own country, but eventually they expand beyond that, and they're selling to the whole neighborhood, right? This is the kind of thing that also creates the support networks for people to move in. I actually remember this with my mother, was not an entrepreneur, but was very much a sort of a local neighborhood activist. And, she was an immigrant, and she started off really in networks of her own country. She was from Denmark. So she started off in everything Danish and Scandinavian you could possibly find in our hometown. And it turns out there was more than I expected, but eventually became like as she became more comfortable in English, more comfortable in the country, she became very much sort of the local anchor of the neighborhood, right? As the person who organized all the events and organized when someone was sick. She was she became that person who was a reference point in the neighborhood, but her entry point was through her own ethnic network, right? And that's often true in the United States because we're a big enough country and we allow people to be who they are, right? That there really is this ability for people to start off often, moving within their own circle, within their own original language, and then spread out and become an entrepreneur in a much broader plane in this country. And there is also, I have to say, the other attraction of the United States, which is not economic, but it really matters, is your ability to be both American and still honor where you came from. And that's not always respected. And look, there are people in this country who push back on that, but there is a sense in which we are all American in the public sphere. And there's certain things we do, like voting, and participation in our neighborhoods that we do together, right? That we do together across boundaries. But who we worship, what language we speak, what customs we follow when we close our doors at home is up to us. That's also part of our private liberty. This country is really built on that sort of notion of unity and plurality, right? And sometimes we forget it. I think sometimes we push back, but that's the origins, right? It was always imperfect. It's been imperfect along the way, but you can come to this country, you can come from Korea and continue to be proud of being Korean and raise your children speaking Korean and yet be an entrepreneur out in your city speaking English, and, you could be an innovator of new technology. You get to be both in this country. And that's something that is not true everywhere. And I think that's also a huge draw for people who are risk takers, who want to start over, but want to do it in a place where they don't completely have to cut off where they came from.
It goes back to the founding of this country.
It does.
We came here for two things. We set up our own rule of law. We're not going to abide by any one religion or anyone with a crown. So we have the freedom, and then we have our rule of law.
Yeah,
people are able to not give up their identity, but to adopt a common identity at the same time without losing oneself.
Exactly.
That's not easy to do in most other countries, and this is one of those qualities that we seldom talk about.
Yeah.
So, however, on the other hand, sometimes I feel that we don't use that term much these days, a melting pot. But I think there's a lot of pot, but not a lot of melting going on. There seems to be a lot of pushback. So maybe we'll pivot a little bit to talk about, since the 1970s, there was Japan and then there's Korea. And we looked at what they call the Rust Belt, and how we have lost a lot of jobs, a lot of industries. There was the beginning of losing manufacturing base in this country. WTO happened for China, and a lot more things exported to China, and gave up even more and even more and even more. So we are basically a service economy, and 75%, 70 to 75% of our GDP comes from services. So we serve each other,
Right.
or entertainment across the world, but we don't make a lot of stuff. All right, we just don't make a lot of stuff, and so we are very much in the leading edge of change and globalization. I see in the back of your wonderful bookshelf had a book on NAFTA, which we don't use that term anymore. But
That's right.
all this free trade and this liberal international order that we have defined, and all that has to do with helped us to continue to be mutually dependent in so many ways.
And that's, I think, a source of strength, but it's also a source of fear, right? I mean, it is, we have competed successfully. I think we as a country, we have made that pivot in a globalized economy. We've led globalization in many ways, but it does create fear, and not everyone has benefited equally from this. And I think we need to be honest about that.
Absolutely. And this is where I want to go. Thank you for saying that, because I think the what I have learned is that we have not retrained, we have not retooled our people who has been displaced from the shrinking manufacturing base. And what I would love to learn from you in that equation is, you see people who have lost their mining jobs. Mining is no longer a big thing, or steel jobs, or whatever, aluminum jobs, or shipbuilding jobs. All those big industries, which is congregated in the mid or south of America. Including Pittsburgh and Billy Joe song and all that stuff.
Allentown, yes.
All that happened, and one of the things that I thought about America, as I learn about America, as I mentioned to you, I'm an immigrant, is the beauty about mobility. We have 50 little countries who got together and become a single country, and that there is no barrier, there's no passport we need to use from Virginia to Maryland or what have you. We can just cross over and we're going to get a job and we pay our taxes. And it's almost like one big country, which really is. Yet, the most wonderful thing about what we have, I thought, was mobility. That there is, wherever job is, wherever there's opportunity, we go and we dig gold, or we build railroads, or whatever it is. And east to west, west to east, all over in all 50 states of America. Apparently that has not been happening of late. A lot of folks who said, look, my grandfather was a miner in the coal mine, and my father was, and I lost a job. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. I'm entitled to that job. I'm still staying in. Let me just pick on West Virginia for one moment, not picking on them, but let's assuming it's in West Virginia. And they are not looking at mobility. They're not going to say, hey, there's some fishing job in Louisiana that I can make a pretty good darn living. I know nothing much about fishing, but I would love to move there for my family, to build a life, to continue my middle-class existence. So we talked about migration from a foreign land to United States. What about migration within United States? Has that slowed down? And has that been a problem that this group of folks who, right or wrong, feel that they were entitled to certain things, which was taken away from them, and by people who create poisonous rhetoric that it was taken from some third party out there somewhere in another country, may or may not be true. How is migration happening here, and why is it not happening, perhaps? Or maybe I got it all wrong. Would you share your thought on that?
No, you're very right. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that the U.S. economy the U.S. labor market has become bifurcated, right? Where there is a set of people who are doing incredibly well,
yeah,
and a set of people who are doing less well, actually.
Yes.
Race has always been a factor in this, race and ethnicity, but there's also evidence that, Raj Shetty from Harvard just came out with a study actually that sort of suggests that maybe race is becoming less important. It's not that it's not important, it is, but it's maybe becoming less important than class and the starting educational level of parents and where people live, particularly. right? I mean, where people live is you were referring to West Virginia, for example, which is a state that saw a lot of its industries, coal mining and other mining.
Yeah,
Particularly suffer. There certainly, if you look through central Pennsylvania, I mean, you see from Pittsburgh on through central Pennsylvania, you see a lot of the breakdown first of the textile industry and and then of mining industry and all sorts of things that were the basis of steel production, right? Were the basis of the economy. So, two things I think that should worry us. One is this bifurcation and the fact that increasingly education and location become the two things that are the passport to the future, right? And I think that is a really important reality, right? And unless we invest in education and give people a leg up, a lot of people are going to get left behind here, right? And then mobility matters a lot. There's actually a great book called Streets of Gold by I'm going to mess up their names, but Ram Abramitsky and Leah Bustan, who are two economic historians. They find that immigrants do a lot better. We've actually found this in some of our research at Migration Policy Institute as well, that the children of immigrants do better in terms of education and employment than the children of the native born who start off at the same level. If you take the parents with similar education, similar economic level. So, the second generation is doing really well among immigrants. What they find on Streets of Gold, which is, and they do this huge, they use big data for this actually to look at this study. What they find is that there are two reasons why immigrants do well, the children of immigrants do well. One is mobility. It's people are willing to move from one location to another. And so, immigrants are still, this is true of immigrants, but it's also true of children of immigrants. There's a lot more willingness because they aren't attached to the communities in the same way. They're willing to move where there are jobs, where education is better, to pick up their roots. So that's one thing. Second thing is actually that often immigrant parents, even though they may be in non-professional jobs, may be better educated than their jobs, right? And so there may be some of those expectations passed down about going to college and becoming professionals and becoming successful. But we do need to figure out how we actually both bring jobs back to places where people live and we bring people to those jobs and we make sure people have the educational start everywhere to be able to participate. I mean, these are real challenges. And if we don't do that, the peril of this is many people who are living through this. I mean, the biggest perils obviously for people's opportunities, for the opportunities of children growing up, but for the immigration debate, the other side of the peril is, that people look at their opportunities in some places where the jobs have left and they say, we don't know who's stealing our jobs. Is it trade? Is it robots? Or is it immigrants? And I'm not sure I want any of those three. And those may be the wrong answers. We actually may want...
It's a foreign robot that was immigrated.
Exactly. but we actually want immigrants. We want trade, and we certainly want automation, right? And we want innovation and technology. These are things we want. But unless the benefits of those three things reach the people who are being left behind, they have a real reason to push back.
And so, if you listen to the rhetoric, this country is going to tear apart. I mean, I don't believe that's the case, but if you listen to the rhetoric, it seems like it, which is very unfortunate because all of us came from somewhere at one time to this country.
Although it's interesting, Philip, I know you and I have talked about this before, but I actually, when I look at the polling on this, what it tells us is that most Americans think immigration is good. They know, because immigration is personal. Most people in this country at this point, if they're not immigrants themselves, their parents were, their spouse is, their brother or sister-in-law is, or their son or daughter-in-law, or their, our close friend at work. I mean, immigration is part of our lives. And so Americans, yes, there's some people who truly hate immigration, who think the country's changing and it shouldn't. But most Americans accept that immigration is a good thing. What they worry about is how people come. And they worry about the fact that we don't seem to have control over the way that people are coming into the country, particularly at the southwest border. And so this is a solvable issue if politicians are willing to figure out orderly ways for people to come into the country. It isn't that in fact, the U.S., like Canada, I mean, these are societies, and Australia, these are societies that are uniquely accustomed to immigration, actually, and where the societies, all the global polling also tells us that overall people are much more accepting. They don't, we're not countries that are based on a single culture. We're based on amalgam of cultures, and we have patterns of change over time. but people want to know that there's some order. And going back to your last point, people also want to know that there's opportunity still for them.
That's right. So I think number one, there could be a fear of dilution of their own culture,
Yes.
their being American culture. Number two, I think in the time of scarcity, where we may go through a recession, maybe we'll go through a prolonged slowdown or what have you, people are threatened by losing their own jobs, or they see the old saying is that if your neighbor lost his job, it's a recession, but if you lost your job, it's a depression.
Yes.
So your perspective change, and we tend to want to blame others. Maybe it is reasonable to blame others. Maybe it is not reasonable. Maybe it's our own selves. And those are the time where they will want to point to foreign individuals, immigrants, migrants, because it's easier that way. I'm just talking about human behavior, not right, wrong, and that's been the case for a long time.
And we see this in East Asia too, right? I mean, it's not just, right? I mean, we see Japan and Korea, for example, which really need immigrants and have been taking steps to try and make their immigration laws more flexible, are also struggling with this sense of, do they lose who they are
Exactly.
if immigrants come in? There's a debate in Italy and in France about this. Do they become less French and less Italian? In some ways, we're ahead of this, right? I mean, there is a segment of Americans that really don't want any foreigners coming to this country, right? I mean, despite the fact that pretty much anyone in this country, if they're not an immigrant themselves, they would have a parent or grandparent, or you don't have to go really far back in the family tree in anyone in this country, unless they're Native American, to find someone that came from somewhere else. And also Native Americans came from somewhere else, but that's a lot further back, right? They certainly were here first, but it was, the world has always been in motion, right? I mean, all of us in this planet came from somewhere else. So
That's right.
But the reality is, for most people in this country, that what is American culture? At some point, there was a war against spaghetti, right? I mean, spaghetti and meatballs was an Italian, that isn't American. That's an Italian thing, right? And they're invading us. Now it's the most American food you can eat, right? And pizza, right? I mean, what's more American than getting a slice of pizza in New York or Chicago? But, that was foreign food way back when, right? I mean, this is, this constantly evolves. What it means to be American constantly evolves in all sorts of fascinating ways. And frankly, it is what makes this such an incredibly successful and fascinating country, an attractive country. It's also what makes our entertainment industry so great, because everyone in the world can see pieces of themselves in American culture, right? I mean, I've always thought American movies, American music, why is that? I mean, yes, it's because Hollywood is successful and the LA music studios do well and they don't have mix good music. Yeah, that's true. But it's also, there's something about American culture that anyone, anywhere in the world can read an American novel, can listen to, American music, R&B or pop or hip hop and, or jazz, or they can, watch a movie and they'll see some piece of themselves, or it'll reflect some piece of themselves, because this country was built up through people coming together from so many places. So it is our great strength, even if it's sometimes hard to go through the changes that produces.
That's right. So I think for us, that's part of our soft power. That our music, our culture, which transcends other cultures, having English as the universal language also helps.
That too. That does help.
People can understand. I mean, if I speak Hindu and I do the same dance as a Hollywood dance, it doesn't quite do it because not enough people understand it. So, no, absolutely. And also this freedom, this liberty, and all the basic tenets that made America what it is continue to shine brightly. So I think that it's actually a compliment to the United States for the amount of people who want to come here legally, illegally, swimming through it, climbing through it, walking through it, crawling through it, whatever, to come here. It speaks volumes about who we are as a country. But where do we go from here? We haven't had a major immigration bill in this country. I know when was the last one. It's been a long time. If you become president and you can do something about immigration, what kind of immigration bill are you looking to be a reasonable way to start course correcting, if there's such a thing, about illegal vis-a-vis legal, about the massiveness vis-a-vis not, about all the things that people talk about that may not be real issues, but that's inciting their fear. What are some of the things that you would do as a policy person? What would you suggest?
I think, we used to dream about a comprehensive immigration reform and, we would fix our immigration system. We do everything we should do at once. And, it's hard in the United States, in our political system, which is built on checks and balances and has become increasingly polarized on top of that to get big things done. So I've always thought, in recent years, I would say I've always thought that in recent years, I've come around to thinking that we need to do things in smaller bites, right? And I think the first thing we have to do is around the border. Maybe it's not the most important, but I think it is for an important segment of the American population. And that means shifting our asylum laws. It means having more resources dedicated to processing people adequately at the border. We do have a strong interest in providing protection for people who are fleeing for their lives, but we also have to be able to return people who are arriving without documents and don't have a protection claim. But secondly, if we don't pivot quickly to the second one, we're going to have trouble, which is then we have to fix the visa system, right? Which is the bigger and more important question. And, it's been 34 years. The outlines of our immigration system are really from 1965. Some of the specifics were added in 1990. But this is an old, we're driving a 60-year-old car here, right? We're trying to hold it together, as best we can. This is a time to go out and buy a new car. This is a time to figure out a visa system that is flexible, that is employer driven to the extent possible so that it fluctuates with the actual labor market, and with the economic cycles, allows people in sectors where we know we have a real need. There are areas like construction and care work where we just don't have ways of people coming in. And there are huge sectors that are heavily immigrant dependent, but also high skilled immigration. We probably want more people who are highly skilled coming in. So we need to figure out the visa system. And then the third piece, which I think has to come afterwards, again, would love it if everything came at the same time. But, we probably have about 11 to 12 million people in this country who are living here who don't have permanent documents. They're living here permanently. Some of them do have temporary status of different sorts, but some have DACA, some have temporary protected status, some have asylum petitions that are pending, but most have no documents. We need to begin figuring out at least how certain groups there, anyone who's been here more than 15 or 20 years, people that are married to a U.S. citizen or have U.S. citizen children. We can figure out the criteria, but some of those folks we should bring out of the shadows too, because they'll be more productive. It'll help our economy. That's the kind of thing that is good for them, but frankly is good for the rest of us too. And all of this would help. It's not just, we should stop thinking that immigration is about immigrants. I say that just to be controversial some of the time, but also because I think it is, immigration is frankly about everyone. It's about immigrants, it's about children of immigrants. It's about people who've been here for 16 generations, right? It is about how we make our economy work in a way that is productive, that's innovative, that's entrepreneurial, that is driving our country forward. And if we structure immigration laws in the right ways, we're going to end up continue to be the most successful economy on earth.
I know you're running for office, so would you like to tell me which office you're running?
I am staying out of office because actually I think this is one of those issues where you need to be able to speak to people on all sides. This is an interest where business and labor, where Republicans and Democrats, where people who are in mostly rural states and mostly urban states need to be talking with each other. And so this is, I'm very proud to be in a nonpartisan organization where actually we try and have conversations with different sectors of society on this, because I think it's too big an issue for anyone to have, full control of the truth on it.
And we thank you for that. I think it's so important to have a voice that people can respect and not taking sides per se, in perception at least, that you can be the honest broker, if there's such a thing, in an issue to show why these are important and how that is helping America to advance to continuous prosperity, to continue forward.
I think that's right. Yeah, and this is ultimately it's about it is about that. It's about prosperity. It's about success. It's about creating a society in which we're all moving forward.
So one last question for you, I could speak all the rest of the day with you, and you probably don't have any more patience for me, but
Philip, infinite patience. Yeah.
Thank,
But for you, yes.
thank you. So we see climate change, no matter we believe it's real or not, climate is changing. We are not going to get into what caused climate change, but climate change is happening. And it's happening in a way that is going to get hotter and more unpredictable for at least for as long as we can see. And that is happening at parts of the world that is going to drive more migration. I'm talking about both internally and externally because they can no longer continue in whatever region they live because it's too hot and they don't have enough water or water, which is another, shrinking resource or drinkable water or what have you. So in the next 20 years or so, we're going to probably have more political issues with migrants, voluntarily or otherwise. I mean, if you look at even just the Russia-Ukraine war, we have received quite a few Ukrainians in this country as well. And you look at how Germany, the last chancellor, lost her popularity because she allows so many Syrians in. Right or wrong, it doesn't matter. That is just a pinhole of what it could happen. Because in the future, what are we going to do with 1 million people knocking at the border? Are we just going to let them just stay at the border? We're going to build that wall or whatever it is that we're going to build and not let them in. And what do you see are some of the geographical population related challenges that it's coming? It's a slow train
Coming. So this is, I think this is, now we're getting to the, really to the base of the foundation here, right? Which is demography is destiny to begin with, right? That we're in a world where, the Japans, Koreas, Italy's, Spain's, but also United States and Brazil and Malaysia, lots of countries that are, have lower than replacement rate
Yes.
birth rates, right? And so the population is going down or will start to go down. The United States, actually, it's not going down because of immigration, but would go down if we just had native-born workers.
The replacement rate is still 1.62, 1.5.
Well, it still is. It still is low. Actually, that is true. So even with immigration, it's still low. So and Canada is the same with very robust immigration, but it's still below replacement rate. But so there are going to be people moving to this country. This is why we see people coming in, right? It is half the labor force growth is immigration right now. But the same thing is going to be true in Europe and East Asia and parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America, right? This is going to happen one way or another. People are going to be coming from the places that have excess populations, right? Where there still is population growth for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, a few places in Central America and the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. And so we know that's going to happen, right? And the question becomes, how do we figure out how to create the channels so this happens legally? Do people come permanently or do they come temporarily as circular workers? How do we structure this? But then there's two things that really accentuate this that you've mentioned. One is conflict.
Yes.
And conflict isn't new. The world has seen more violent times than today, but the world has also seen more peaceful times. There was a brief period between the end of the Cold War and maybe a decade ago where conflicts became much less geopolitical.
Yes.
They are geopolitical again. Every local conflict becomes accentuated by geopolitical conflicts, right? And so we should expect to see people displaced by wars, by civil wars, as well as interstate wars, which we've now seen a return to. So, there is a whole question of conflict also being an X factor. It'll go up and down depending in different regions, depending on what's going on. These will be unknown factors, but then climate is the final thing that you have to put into the picture. And there are parts of this world, the area around the Sahel and around some of the other, desert areas, arid places in the world, a number of coastal areas in the Caribbean and in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific, where we really are seeing life become unsustainable for people,
Yeah.
right? And most people are going to stay near where they are. They're going to medium-sized cities, maybe capitals of the country where they live, but some of them will cross international borders, right? And it is not that we're going to see a massive stampede of people to Europe and the United States. That's unlikely, but it is going to be, if you add that into conflict and if you add that into the pull factor, which is where you started the conversation today, right? The pull factor in the United States, which is, the fact that there are countries that actually need workers,
Yes.
people who already had an interest in leaving because they could see life was better somewhere else. but suddenly are displaced either by conflict or by their precarious life becoming unsustainable, we can see how people are going to be moving in the coming years in larger numbers, and we need to be ready for it. And we need to also assume that people have, in a world that's become more connected by airlines and boats and train lines and cars, and especially by technology, where people can see what's going on elsewhere, and they have GPS, and they have WhatsApp chat groups, and they have, they have all sorts of social media to know what people, how to navigate a route. People are going to have more agency to move as well. So we should assume this is happening, and our big bet should be, how do we make it happen in a regular, predictable, legal, safe way that can be sustainable over time and doesn't create too much of a backlash? And also, how do we then help those countries that people are leaving also develop and be less of a push factor? We still may be pulling people in some of the countries like the United States because we'll need workers, but it would be great if people were coming because of opportunity and not because they felt pushed out.
So we have GATT, as you know, the General
Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Yes.
And we have WTO, where 160, 170 countries get together and agree to a set of reasonably fair trade policies that we adhere to most of the time. Should we be having an international treaty on migration?
It's a hard one. Yes. I mean, there have been attempts. There is something called the Global Compact on Migration, on safe, orderly, and regular migration. There is a Global Compact on refugees, which is much more, and there is a convention on refugees as well, which is, and that's a smaller subset of people who are moved by force. And that's more agreed on. The other ones, it's hard to actually have a global agreement on migration because we're talking about the sovereignty of borders, right?
Yeah.
It's one thing to say that someone who's forced out because of persecution has a right to enter another country. But for everyone else, sovereign countries do have a right to say about who comes in. And so I think it's harder to have a global treaty. It's easier to have principles.
Yes.
There's also one now in the Western Hemisphere called the Declaration of Los Angeles that has 22 signatory countries, including the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and most of the countries in Latin America and several in the Caribbean. I think the idea of principles and recognizing that mobility is in everyone's interest, but mobility that is managed and planned and done through safe channels is in everyone's interest is a really good thing. But the countries will still insist on making sovereign decisions and having the last word about who comes in. And that's okay. I think in our state-centric world, and look, there are good things about states, right? We can talk about that in another podcast, but the Westphalian Order is a good thing, right? I mean, there's a reason it took over in the rest of the world. It makes sense for many good things we want to do. We should assume we're in a world of sovereign states. And I think it's okay that they have a say about who comes in, but we do want greater appreciation and greater cooperation in creating the channels through which people can move legally.
I'm almost afraid to say any more because I think we wouldn't go on for another 20 minutes or an hour.
We would.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I don't get to have an opportunity to think certainly as deeply as you do, but beg, steal, and borrow from you of your experience, of the way you look at things, and please write more policy papers so that you can help decision makers to think about a longer view. We tend to worry from election cycle to election cycle. We tend to worry about from one GDP per quarter to the next. We really need to look at much longer, looking back in history and looking forward, and how we can replicate the good, and how do we contain those goodness through offices like yours who can help in creating thoughtfulness and providing wisdom. And I encourage, of course, for you to continue your good work for our country, really, really. So thank you so much for spending the time.
Thank you, Philip. It's great to be with you.
I appreciate it greatly and look forward to spending time off camera with you as well.
Likewise.
You can always find more episodes by visiting philipchow.us/podcast or find us on your favorite podcast app. You can always leave us feedback, ask questions, or request a topic for us to discuss by sending an email to pc@philipchow.us.
Views expressed in the Tao of Chao podcast are individual opinions, and they do not represent the employers of each guest or the firm each guest is associated. Our podcasts are for educational and informational purposes only and should not be deemed or viewed as investment advice or recommendations. Please consult your personal financial advisor, investment expert, or investment fiduciary before taking any actions about your plan and investments.